Today I'm joined by Yona Diamond from the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights, Michael Levitt, CEO, FSWC, and of course, our wonderful guest speaker for today, Ron Shimizu. To begin, Yona will offer some opening remarks. Yona Diamond is legal counsel at the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights, international human rights lawyer, and graduate of McGill University and Cardozo Law School. He specializes in pursuing justice for mass atrocity crimes and defending political prisoners, and most recently served as the principal author of the independent report on the Uyghur genocide by over 50 experts in international law, genocide, and the region. Welcome, Yona.
Thank you, Daniela. We at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights are proud to co-host this important event in conversation with series with the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center, and particularly during Asian Heritage Month. Our center is named after one of the greatest humanitarians of the 20th century, Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat who saved tens of thousands of Jews in a matter of 6 months in 1944. We carry on his legacy today by pursuing justice for the victims of mass atrocities and oppression around the world, anchored in remembrance and lessons from the past. So I'm therefore honored on behalf of the Raoul Wallenberg Center to thank Ron Shimizu, a survivor of the mass internment of Japanese Canadians, for speaking with us today. It's an honor and privilege to hear and learn from you. We remember to combat the dangers of forgetting and of indifference today. Ron Shimizu is a Japanese Canadian who was born in an internment camp in 1944. His family was also interned during World War II. He graduated McMaster in 1968 with a BA in political science and a master's in Canadian politics. And he's worked in environment since 1972 on resource management, pollution control programs, focusing on the restoration of the Great Lakes, and ended his tenure in as Ontario Regional Director of the Environmental Protection Branch in 2000. And he worked as an environmental consultant for Resources Future International and took assignments in Canada, India, and Bangladesh until he retired in 2007, and has been very active in the Japanese Canadian community in Toronto since 1975, having served on the board of directors of the Japanese Canadian Cultural Centre and the Toronto Buddhist Church and Greater Toronto Chapter of the National Association of Japanese Canadians. Thank you for being with us today, Ron.
Thank you so much, Yona. We appreciate you joining us and for this afternoon for this important programming and for the ongoing partnership with the Raoul Wallenberg Center. At this time, it's now my pleasure to introduce you to Lynn Deutscher Kobayashi. She currently serves as Vice President of the National Body and President of the Greater Toronto Area Chapter of the National Association of Japanese Canadians to say a few words. Welcome, Lynn.
Oh, thank you, Daniela. I'm here to introduce the video you're about to see, and the maker of this video, which is called Swimming Upstream, Injustice Revealed, is Justice Marika Omatsu. And she is the first Canadian female judge of East Asian descent. Justice Omatsu began her career working for renowned Black civil rights lawyer, Charles Roach. In the 1980s, she was legal counsel for the National Association of Japanese Canadians, which achieved the historic Federal Redress Agreement and Apology. Since then, new research reveals the utter complicity of racist BC politicians in engineering the reprehensible injustices of that time. Asian Canadians in BC were subject to 170 pieces of racially discriminatory legislation, which culminated in the human rights violations against our community. One cannot speak of the history of anti-Asian racism in Canada without knowing the history of Japanese Canadians. We stand in solidarity with all who face racial and other forms of discrimination, and we decry the frightening escalation of anti-Semitism we are seeing as I speak. I'll say no more, as this award-winning video is a compact but comprehensive overview of the most extreme form of anti-Asian racism in Canada's history. Thank you very much for being here today to listen to our story.
Thank you so much, Lynn, and thank you for providing the content for this video. I'm going to show you all of the video right now, and immediately afterwards, Ron will begin his talk, and this way we have a lot of background foundation as well.
In the late 19th century, thousands of Japanese immigrants from a feudal island arrived on these shores to help clear the forest, harvest the seas, and develop the wealth of a young country. What they met was white hostility. In 1895, British Columbia denied Asian people and First Nations people their rights of citizenship. In 1900, Tommy Hama challenged this law. He won in the BC courts, but the province appealed to England's Privy Council and succeeded, preserving its power to deny their vote to Asians and First Nations. Decades of tension and fear of the Yellow Peril erupted when angry whites mobbed Vancouver's Japantown area. Despite the racism, Japanese Canadians continued to thrive in fishing, logging, mining, and farming. They established businesses and raised families. Canada declared war on Japan after the December 7th, 1941 bombing of Pearl Harbor. The War Measures Act was invoked and applied to those of Japanese ancestry, as it had been against German and Italian Canadians in 1939. However, by comparison, German and Italian Canadians were largely unaffected. Those with Japanese ancestry were branded as enemy aliens, ordered to carry ID cards, be fingerprinted, and registered. BC wanted more. All levels of BC governments conspired to expel Japanese Canadians and expropriate their property from the protected area 100 miles inland from the coast. Now is the time to address British Columbia's responsibility and leadership role in ethnic cleansing, property dispossession, and community destruction. Some powerful forces spoke against the removal. The Army's Lieutenant Governor Ken Stewart reported, "I cannot see that they constitute the slightest menace to national security." RCMP Assistant Commissioner Frederick Meade agreed, "No fear of sabotage need be expected from the Japanese in Canada." The Prime Minister's Executive Assistant, Jack Pickersgill, confirmed, "I don't think that there was a member of cabinet who honestly believed that the Japanese were dangerous. It was a British Columbia problem." Initially, Ottawa resisted taking more extreme measures. Despite no evidence of a security risk, BC politicians began a concerted campaign to cleanse the province of Japanese Canadians. In January 1942, Premier John Hart appointed Cabinet Minister George Pearson to lead a BC delegation to Ottawa, where they joined forces with Federal Cabinet Minister Ian Mackenzie to demand the uprooting of all, including women and children. Responsible politicians were BC federal MP Robert Mayhew, along with ministers Royal Maitland and Harry Perry, CCF leader Harold Winch, and MLA Alan Neal. MP Mackenzie went on public record stating, "It is the government's plan to get these people out of BC as fast as possible. It is my personal intention, as long as I remain in public life, to see they never come back here." In the end, Ottawa conceded to BC's demands. On February 24th, 1942, by ordering, all persons of the Japanese race are to leave the protected area. The order was executed quickly. The BC Security Commission, a federal agency, directed the uprooting, dispersal, and incarceration. It involved BC Representative John Shiras and MLAs Maitland, Pearson, and Winch. The camps were often erroneously referred to as internment camps. The Geneva Conventions state a country cannot intern its own nationals, only enemy foreigners. BC refused to pay for children's education, a provincial obligation. The camps relied largely on religious groups and their own resources. More than 2,600 men in 24 labor camps along the Trans-Canada built roads in the interior. The last camp closed in March 1946. To hasten the removal of families from the province, the BC Security Commission advertised these laborers as both industrious and loyal. Resistors to the breakup of families were sent to a POW camp in Ontario. In 1943, George Collins, chair of BC Security Commission, ordered, "These people will be dispersed across Canada in small groups and exiled from BC." In contrast, Japanese Americans were allowed to return to their homes and businesses before the end of the war. However, in 1945, Canada, at the urging of BC politicians, forced all Japanese Canadians to choose between moving east of the Rockies or being shipped to Japan. In the end, 13,000 people were sent east and 4,000 were exiled to Japan. The BC government and the City of Vancouver colluded with the custodian of enemy property in the dispossession. Vancouver City Council wanted to redevelop the Powell Street area. The city urged Glenn McPherson, the custodian's Vancouver representative, to sell all Japanese Canadian homes and businesses in that area. McPherson collaborated with the BC's Municipal Affairs Minister, Edward Bridgman, to obtain municipal property assessment records. Then, McPherson met with Vancouver officials to discuss their interest in acquiring properties. In January 1943, despite Ottawa's initial reluctance, Cabinet bowed to BC pressure and granted the custodian of enemy property the right to dispose of everything without Japanese Canadians' consent. BC judges Sidney Smith and David Whiteside approved each forced sale. The proceeds from the sales paid for the incarceration, contrary to the Geneva Conventions. In the US, there was no seizure or sale of property. Gone was Vancouver's Japantown, the geographical heart of the community, where the pulse was felt, where more than 8,000 people lived, worked, and played. 59 language schools in the province were closed. Education was disrupted. Vibrant business communities were wiped out. Future generations lost touch with their heritage, resulting in the loss of language and culture. Prime Minister Mackenzie King declared in 1944, "It is a fact that no person of the Japanese race born in Canada has been charged with any act of sabotage or disloyalty during the years of the war." But post-war BC continued its racist policies. BC reaffirmed the denial of the vote to Japanese Canadians and First Nations in March 1947. In 1948, BC's Premier Brian Johnson prevented Japanese Canadians from returning to the coast. BC agreed to pay half of the cost of their continued exile. In the same year, the province reimposed a 1902 ban that prevented Japanese Canadians from working as loggers on Crown lands. Slowly, the tide changed, and in April 1949, Japanese Canadians won the rights of citizenship through a national political campaign. Almost 40 years later, honor was restored with the signing of the redress settlement with the federal government. The terms included $21,000 to each survivor, $12 million to a community fund, and $24 million for a race relations foundation.
Okay. Thank you again, Lynn, for providing this video content for us. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ron Shimizu to tell his very personal sort of story and his family's story and aspects of some of this history. Ron, thank you again so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Danielle. First, I'd like to thank the friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies and the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights, and also the Greater Toronto Chapter of the National Association of Japanese Canadians for inviting me to give this talk. And of course, I'd like to thank my mom and dad, my late mom and dad, my brothers and sisters, some of whom are listening to me and will correct me after the presentation for passing on their memories. After all, it was mom and dad, my older brothers and sisters, who truly experienced the internment, the discrimination, and really helped resettle the family in Ontario after the war. So being the youngest son, I was the benefit of their suffering and their hard work in resettlement. And for that, I thank them very much. I'm going to tell my story basically in three parts. The first is the immigration years. The second is the years of suffered as enemy aliens. And the third is becoming a citizen in Canada. And I'm really grateful that the video Swimming Upstream was shown to you first, because it gives you a wonderful background of the larger picture of what was happening to the Japanese community in Canada. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. First, some background. Just basically, Japanese immigration into Canada started in force in the 1870s. There was a Japantown, as mentioned in the video, that centered in East Vancouver. The settlers did focus on three sectors: fishing, farming, and forestry. And as the video showed, that there was reaction to the influx of Japanese immigrants. You had the riots in Paul Street. An interesting family story was my father, who came over to Canada around that time and lived in Japantown just after the riots, mentioned that the Japanese business owners and homeowners in that area had piled bricks and whatnot on the rooftop, ready in case the rioters came back again. They were going to be ready for them. And as the video showed, the Japanese did not have the vote at that time. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is a picture of my grandfather, Shimizu. He came over in 1897. He left the prefecture of Wakayama in Japan and settled in Vancouver. The picture with the two boys and my grandfather. My father, Toshiro Shimizu, is one with the cap, and he was born in 1891. Next slide, please. They arrived in Canada in 1907, when grandfather called them over. The boys were schooled in Japan, and they went through middle school, vocational school. And then after school for a bit, father did work on a coastal freighter in Japan. But then grandfather called them over in 1907, and they lived in rented rooms in Japantown in Vancouver and worked at odd jobs. Next slide, please. A few years later, grandfather decided to take the boys and himself to the mouth of the Fraser River. At that time, there was a village there called Steveston. It's been since incorporated into the town or city of Richmond. And there was quite a flourishing fishing industry out of Steveston at that time, canneries, and fish were abundant in the mouth of the Fraser River and in the adjacent seas. The boys were enrolled in an apprenticeship program at a Japanese shipbuilder, boat builder, and they graduated as journeymen shipwrights, I guess. But by the 1920s, the fishing in the local waters got thin as overfished. And the Japanese fishermen found themselves moving further away to gain their catch. Grandfather and the boys, by this time in their late teens, moved to a small village on the west coast of Vancouver Island, Ucluelet, which is just south of Tofino, a well-known resort town today. And they established homes there and a shipbuilding business, a small one, but nevertheless a small boat building business. Next slide, please. They acquired property and built homes. My dad built the house at the back of this picture. The larger house in the front is a store owned by an English family or a family from England. They were called the Saggers, I believe. And they were reasonably good neighbors. By this time, the boys, my father and his brother, were of marriageable age. Marriages were arranged for them in Japan, and my father said he went back to Japan to get married and then spent some time there and then came back and called mother over. Families were started. Our family had five brothers. Unfortunately, two passed away in infancy, and three sisters, and they were all born either in Ucluelet or the closest town, large town at that time was Port Alberni. Next slide, please. Now, mother learned English style cooking from her English neighbor. The families did play together, but the Japanese families at this time became quite a number of them now. They got together, built a language school, hired a teacher from Japan, put him up, and their children attended Japanese language school from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. after their day session at the English school. Also around this time, the Japanese fishermen got together and formed a cooperative, mainly to gain better prices for fish they caught. At that time, they would have to sell to a middleman, and they felt that they weren't getting the best price for their catch. So they themselves formed the co-op, which in turn hired packer boats, and the packer boats and the co-op took their catch to Vancouver and Seattle, where they gained much better prices. Next slide, please. And this is the Shimazu family with my mother in the center, my two brothers, and my three sisters. And the other picture shows the boys playing with the neighborhood lads at the Spring Cove Wharf. Next slide, please. Now, these are the boats that my father and uncle built. The trawler in front is my dad's boat, and the one behind is my uncle's boat, and the larger boat is the Saggers boat. And they were all built by the Shimazu brothers boat works. And the picture with the boat in Spring Cove is my dad's first boat. And I guess he's one of the two figures standing on the stern there. Next slide, please. So towards the end of the immigrant years, the Japanese families were well established, and the life there, from what I can gather from stories from my sisters, was a pretty stable way of life. And even in spite of the discriminatory restrictions you heard, the Japanese fishermen were faced with things such as each year, I think for a time there, the Fisheries Commission tried to restrict the number of licenses they issued to Japanese fishermen and things of that ilk. But a benefit of being in a smaller community outside of Vancouver or Victoria was that they were a self-sufficient community with a livelihood. And so they felt they were sheltered from the worst of the Depression years. And as many of you know, the Depression years in Canada were very severe right across the whole population. All that changed with the declaration of war in December of after Pearl Harbor. Next slide, please. So immediately as war was declared with Japan, at that time, there was about 23,000 Japanese, of which 75% were Canadian citizens. Of that 75%, 60%, the majority were Canadian born, and 15% were naturalized citizens. So immediately following the declaration of war, it's written that authorities arrested 38 Japanese men as suspected security risks. But as you also heard in the video, and also widely reported and documented now, is that both the RCMP and the military formally reported that the Japanese did not pose any security threat. Nevertheless, all Japanese had to register as enemy aliens under the War Measures Act, and there you see a picture of the registration. Next slide, please. So there was 1,200 or 1,300 fishing boats seized and impounded. Father and his friends had to take their boats in bad weather several days to New Westminster, escorted by a Navy destroyer. Apparently, in the case of Father's group, an armed sailor was placed on each boat. And as my sister indicated to me, she said, the father said that luckily the armed sailor was a pleasant man. Such is life, I guess. Next slide, please. Now, all Japanese families within 100 miles of the coast were forcibly evacuated. And our family had to leave Ucluelet in March of 1942 with 48 hours notice and 1 suitcase per person. Families were taken by boat, train, and motor vehicles to a temporary shelter in Vancouver. And it turned out to be Hastings Park Exhibition Grounds in Vancouver. And that's a picture of the reception arena for the evacuees. Next slide, please. Now, sleeping quarters into stables. This is, the quote is from my sister, my oldest sister, Sachiko's account. After the initial shock of being housed in stables, we got busy scrubbing out the horse stables, which were to be our sleeping quarters until the next move. It was a week before there was any privacy in the washrooms. Her thought every day was, what did we do to deserve this? Next slide, please. My families were sent out of Hastings Park to an internment camp, a series of internment camps in around Slocan. Because Father was a carpenter, he was sent ahead with a group of men to help actually build the huts in the internment camp. And the picture there is one of the internment camps, not just a short distance from Slocan. It was called Lemon Creek. And quite a few Japanese were stationed there. Next slide, please. The video mentioned Tashmi, and this gives you another view of Tashmi and sort of the conditions during the harsh winter. Now, you could imagine the huts were hastily built. It's quite common knowledge now in the community, people recalling that as the green lumber shrank, there was cracks and the snow would blow in. So people would try to stuff newspaper into the cracks to stop the snow from blowing in. So you could imagine the kind of living condition it was. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. 699 men were, whoever protested being interned or being separated from families or protested against becoming forced labor on farms or road camps, they were put into a prison and they were shipped east to POW camps in Ontario, and they lived in these camps alongside captured German soldiers. Next slide, please. So here's a sort of a summary. 945 men sent to work in road camps, 4,000 into sugar beet farms. And by the way, the people that were sent to sugar beet farms really suffered badly. Their housings were given to them were really meager. There's accounts of people having to sleep in chicken coops, if you could imagine. And there were a few that were detained in Vancouver, and some were, in fact, that were very sick, had to stay in hospital at Hastings Park. Next slide, please. So moving on from enemy alien to becoming a Canadian citizen, this basically gives you an idea that at the beginning, the BC government really wanted to get the Japanese out of the province. They wanted them deported, and they really pressured Ottawa for that. And in fact, the government seriously considered that. It was until they faced the opposition from the Japanese themselves, with the support of the churches and the CCF party at that time, that they finally rescinded that thinking and moved it to voluntary exile. The other thing there is that the intern families left camp with hardly any resources to restart their lives. The freedom of movement within Canada for Japanese was still restricted. You had to get permission to travel. And then on top of that, some municipalities in the prairies and in Ontario opposed the settlement and practiced a quota system. In fact, in Toronto, we have stories where people who came all the way out east on a train ride, after a long train ride, were met at Union Station by Toronto officials and told they couldn't get off, that they couldn't settle there. And that's why we had some families who wanted to be in Toronto, but a lot of families rather settled in the outskirts of Toronto, which weren't part of Toronto at that time, places like Port Credit. And of course, the Japanese remained without franchise during this period. Next slide, please. So my family was faced with that harsh choice. And here's something that was quite sad, I think, in that you have two brothers who tried to establish homes in Canada, worked all their lives, and now in their 50s, having to make this decision for themselves and their families. My uncle, Kuroku, he decided to take the family back to Japan. And he returned to a Japan that was ravaged, that had been ravaged by war, lack of food. It was just a very tough life for them. My father decided to take the family eastward. And there's the picture with my family, and I'm the babe in arms. I'm slightly embarrassed when people call me a survivor because I was born in the camp in 1944. But as you can see, as a babe in arms, I would not have remembered much of what has happened. So I am really indebted to my brothers and sisters and parents for having passed on the family history as best that they could recall. Next slide, please. The move eastward for my family was from Slocan by train, several days by train, to Northern Ontario, to Nays Hostel, which is on the north shore of Lake Superior. And the industry in that, and the main activity in that area, of course, at that time was lumbering or pulp and paper. And the family secured a temporary job over the winter of 46-47, working for the Pigeon Lumber Company. And the family stayed in the lumber company camp, which is about, I think, 15 miles north of Nays Hostel. Nays Hostel was the railway stop. And they stayed there over the winter. And the older siblings, my brothers and sisters, worked in the camp as cook and kitchen help. Next slide, please. From Naze to Vineland, Ontario, again, through friends. And the network here was not through any government authority, but basically an informal network of friends. And family, our family arranged, father's friend arranged for us to have a place on a fruit farm in Vineland, Ontario, 30 kilometers east of Hamilton. And that move took place in the spring of '47, and we stayed there till 1950. The family, during that time, the family lived in a tenant's farmhouse on the farm, and everyone worked on the farm. And the house was pretty basic, no running water. As a kid, I remember there was a pump in the kitchen and a large cistern outside. And mother, in order to cook, and my sisters would have to pump the water into the sink. And we didn't, there was an outdoor privy, which was a bit of a hassle getting to in the wintertime, if you could imagine. Now the picture there shows my family working on the farm. The lady on the right or left, depending on what, with the cap is my mother. My father is kneeling on the ground and I'm beside him, the little lad. And my sister is sitting on the ladder, and my brother Gordon is kneeling down there. And some of Mr. Reichman and Don Reichman, the farmer, and his son are there. And the other folks are, oh, the daughter, Mitzi Reichman is there. The others are other farmhands. As it turned out, the Reichmans were a very kind family, and they took pains to show the family around. The Reichmans, I remember the Reichmans, I believe, took my older brothers and sisters into Toronto to see Toronto, to see friends in Toronto. As a kid, I remember being taken along on the big truck to visit the canneries where the fruit were taken to be processed. So in a way, the life was hard, but again, it was, we had the benefit of having some kind hosts at that point in time. Next slide, please. Now here's some unfinished business, even though we were out of the camp, some unfinished business from the internment and our involvement in it. Now, in order to move from Naze, the lumber camp, down to Vineland, Father still had to apply to the government to move to Vineland. And the letter that you see there is a letter from the Department of Labor, Federal Department of Labor, giving Father permission to move to Vineland or to take the train to Vineland. And they also asked him to report in when at the closest, I can't remember if it's the RCMP office that they had arrived. Another firm memory in my mind is that in 1949, at night, on the farm, there was a knock on the door, and this very large Mountie appeared, and he had in his hand the shotgun that my father had turned in 1942, as ordered. So my father did get back a firearm, which I still have as a memento of that period. Next slide, please. So here are some, just a listing of some of the post-war actions. As I mentioned before, the government, this is our Canadian government seriously considered deporting all Japanese at the urging of BC leaders. It was the churches and the CCF which strongly opposed the deportation. There is still no right to vote until 1949. The Royal Commission to investigate Japanese property claims in response to strong protests from Japanese and other supporters. That commission set up in 1947. As it turned out, the payout from the commission approximated 10 cents on the dollar on each dollar of claim they received. My sister kept father's claims for $990 to the commission, for which he received $168. Earlier in 1942, the custodian of enemy property gave my father $390 after expenses for selling his boat, which he valued at $1,200. So the family likely left the camp with little over $500, if that. Next slide, please. So in 1950, the family moved into Hamilton. Father thought at that point it'd be a better opportunities employment-wise. And by this time, my oldest sister, Sachko, had married and set up a household in family in Hamilton. Now, father was now in his late 50s. He was hired by Leander Boat Club to maintain and repair their racing shells. And as it turned out, he enjoyed the job. It was near water and he could use his skill. And he enjoyed watching the young men row. He followed the club to the various regattas. And I got to go along with him. My sister and I got to go along with him to some of these regattas. He worked there until he retired in his mid-70s. Next slide, please. Well, the preoccupation in that era was for the family was to find to get our own home. So in 1952, father purchased a building lot south of Ontario, or south of Hamilton. And I remember being taken out there and seeing a cornfield with corn stubble on it, and father pointing out to it that that's our lot. And there was stakes in the ground demarcating the lot that he had bought. This was at Reichman's Corners. For those of you familiar with Hamilton, this is at Reichman's Corners, which is about 5 or 6 miles just outside of Hamilton at that time. Now it's been incorporated into the city of Hamilton. Like most immigrant families, everybody pitched in to build the house. And they worked very hard on evenings, weekends, holidays, over 4 years to build the house that you see in the picture. And that's a house that essentially I grew up with. And I benefited from having that house. It turned out to be one of the nicest houses on the street. It was one heck of a lot of work. The family actually moved into it half completed. And the house, and it was in 1955 that the house was completed, gardens put in place, and the family had its own home since 1942. Next slide, please. This is the one regret we all share, that in 1958, my mom died of a stroke. And the tragedy of it all was that she died just as the family was regaining its feet. And she wasn't there to bear the benefits of resettlement. Next slide, please. Now, in better times, from the 60s forward, my older brother and dad bought lots in building lots way up in the Bruce Peninsula near Wyerton. And dad and my brother Jack, my older brother Jack, had apprenticed as a carpenter. And he, with dad's help, built a family cottage. And it's still in the household, and that my sister Marie in Mississauga is still, and her husband own the cottage today. Another thing in the 70s, and father now well in his 70s, after he retired from Leander Boat Club, I came home from school one day and found him in the basement, and he had laid the keel for a 17-foot sailboat. He had squashed the keel in between the pillars, supporting pillars of the basement and the furnace. And he was busy whacking away with wood, making this 17-foot sailboat. And my job that summer, after he completed it, was to dig out the basement wall on one side of the house while he put a hole in the basement wall, and we got all the neighbors together to pull out this sailboat from the basement. It was quite a community event. Next slide, please. Now, Dad also was always trying to be busy with his hands. And he made this wonderful model of his trolling boat fishing off of Euclid. And he made that out of scraps of wood. In fact, the mountains and the waves that he all made by hand were slats taken from old orange crates. He also made an articulated model of heavy H rowing. He used to repair these boats at Leander Boat Club and knew them intimately. And the nice thing about this, or the unique thing about this model, is that each of the oarsmen have articulated arms. And they, when you turn the wheel, they actually go through the rowing motion. Next slide, please. In 1977, the Japanese community across Canada celebrated their centennial, their 100 years of settlement in Canada. And there was a whole bunch of events, national concerts, educational seminars. One particular one that was important to the community was a seminar on the War Measures Act and the need to have it reformed or repealed. A national photo contest, publications of books on our history, and many local Japanese community events happened. One lasting thing from that centennial was a commemorative bell was given from the 17,000 Japanese Canadians in Ontario to the government of Ontario. Bill Davis was the premier at that time. And the bell was placed in Ontario Place. And that wonderful belfry was made by Raymond Moriyama, a member of our community, actually a world famous architect. Next slide, please. So when we celebrated the centennial, one of the interesting or unique features of the centennial in looking back at our history was to reawaken or awaken a community interest to pursue formal settlement of injustices of the internment of Japanese Canadians. And a decade-long campaign ensued, and it was not an easy campaign. In fact, at the beginning, there were many families and many in the community that felt that this issue shouldn't be raised. It's over and done with. Others felt that strongly there had to be some kind of settlement, acknowledgement of the injustice, and a settlement for the damage done. Groups started to organize around it, and research was done. Funds were raised for a formal analysis by Price Waterhouse of the economic losses due to the forced evacuation. They came up with an assessment of some 400 million. Its interesting fact is that the city of Toronto, under Mayor Art Eggleton at that time, actually contributed to that study. That speaks to the fact that many in many non-Japanese organizations and individuals recognized the injustice and supported that there should be some form of settlement. The newly formed National Association of Japanese Canadians led the negotiations. Mariko Matsu, who produced the film that we just saw, was a key participant of the negotiating, a key member of the negotiating team. She was a legal advisor to the negotiating team. Politically, I think the fact that the US government announced a redress settlement for Japanese Americans a few months before our settlement in 19, it probably served as a prompt to our own federal government to come forward and bring to closure negotiations for a settlement agreement. I'm proud to say that my family took part in the redress campaign. My brother on Vancouver Island at that time took an active part in the Vancouver Island group, redress group, and my sister Polly took a very active role in the Hamilton group. And I was involved at the initial stages in Hamilton, in Toronto. Next slide, please. A journey's end for my dad. My dad received his apology and settlement payment a few months before his death at age 99 and 98. And thinking back on it, I doubt it would have offered him much satisfaction, even if he weren't suffering from dementia at the time. His home and livelihood had been taken from him. The family had suffered much hardship and loss. It was all caused by the BC politicians and a cunning prime minister of the time. So you could imagine that it had cut very deeply. For my siblings, there was a sense of satisfaction in the formal acknowledgement by the federal government of the gross injustice. And I like to think that gaining the redress settlement affirmed Japanese Canadians' faith in a democratic Canada and its commitment to respect the Charter of Rights. But another lesson was that governments and politicians must be closely monitored at all times. Next slide, please. So finally, in 2005, we had a family reunion in Vancouver and in Ucluelet. We all met at Vancouver. It was sort of a week-long thing. We all met in Vancouver and got together with cousins, long cousins that we hadn't seen for a long time, and their families. And then from that group, 19 of us managed to all get out together to Ucluelet. And here my older brothers and sisters met their counterpart cousins that they grew up with in Ucluelet. And they had a wonderful time. It was memorable. And I thank my oldest sister, Shachko Betty, who asked me in her 80s, she asked me, she says, Ron, she says, before I go, I want to meet with all the cousins in Ucluelet again, and I want you to organize the reunion. So that was as the youngest, that was my chore. And it was a wonderful experience for me. So I'm glad we had that opportunity. So it sort of brought to us, or at least to me, it closed the circle, if you will, of the Shimazu saga. Next slide, please. So here's the Shimazu siblings today. Sachiko Betty Shimizu, she passed a few years ago at 95 in Aurelia. My sister Shigeko Shimizu is 92 in Burlington, Ontario. My brother Jack is 90 in Chemainus. My brother Gordon Masahiro is 88 in West Van. And Sister Marie in Mississauga, my closest friend, is 84, and I'm 77. And I have two brothers I've never met who passed in infancy, and they're buried in the Ucluelet Cemetery. Next slide, please. So here are the lasting effects, I think. And some of this was covered by the video, but I think it's worth reiterating is that, the lack of a Japantown really has a cultural impact on a community. Every immigrant group that I can think of did start off in this country with some sort of a central place, and that has been denied the Japanese. The loss of language and due to the dispersal, that really goes to the destruction of a community. And the impact for us that we're suffering from right now, not necessarily, it's not all bad, of course, but it is an impact. Is that, as mentioned in the video, our third and fourth generation can't speak the language. We have the highest out marriage rate amongst ethnic groups in Canada. And that brings into question the future of the community, because with the lack of language, a mixed fourth and fifth generation, very low immigration from Japan into Canada, really the future of the Japanese Canadian community is in question. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand it back to our host, Daniela.
Thank you so much, Ron. On behalf of everybody, that was so educational and so heartbreaking. And I think it's so important for us to hear this story and these voices. And I want to thank you for sharing your family's sort of very heart-wrenching and very traumatic experiences. It's such an important part of our history as Canadians that isn't necessarily often talked about or taught about in schools, which is why we wanted to bring this to light to our viewers here this evening. Thank you again so much for sharing everything. It's been absolutely unforgettable, and I'm sure everyone on the call feels exactly the same way. Our president and CEO, Michael Levitt, wanted to come on to also say a couple of words. He's been listening into this as well. Michael, the floor is yours.
We're live. Okay, there we go. Thank you very much, Daniela. Ron, that was an absolutely fascinating journey. And I think Daniela used the word heartbreaking. But I think what's so amazing is it's a story not often enough told. And I'm so pleased. One of the things that we do with this In Conversation series is reach out to other communities to hear about their pain and their hardships as well, because it brings us together, it bonds us. And there's been that long-standing bond between the Japanese community and the Jewish community. We've got an event tomorrow with the Japanese Consul General, the consulate, and we're going to be talking, I'm sure, in part about the common bonds and the fact that when many of the Japanese Canadians moved to Toronto, there was a number of Jewish families that were very active in providing work and support. Why? Because they understood the challenges of losing it all, of having it all stripped away with no opportunity to protest, to be heard, voices, property, lives, all just kind of stripped away in that moment. So I'm really grateful that you've shared this. You shared your family story, provided this testimony for all of us. I also want to thank Lynn. I think Lynn's hand's up. I'm seeing a hand up there. I want to thank Lynn for her comments at the beginning and for recognizing the anti-Semitism that the Jewish community is dealing with at the moment specifically, but also I want to recognize the anti-Asian hate that we know is so palpable right now across Canada. And again, it's events like this and opportunities during what is both Jewish Heritage Month and Asian Heritage Month for us to come together and bond as communities, as Canadians who share elements of a common past. So again, thank you. I want to thank Yona from the Wallenberg Centre and all the staff, Erwin and all the team at the Wallenberg Centre. Of course, I want to thank Daniela and the education. Oh, there's Yona. Hey. And I want to thank all of our education department at FSWC, who worked so hard to be able to put together this program and this ongoing program with the folks at Wallenberg. And again, really special when we have other voices coming in and sharing that journey with us. It really is. It's something that broadens out. And I think, again, as I said, Ron, not a story told often enough, but certainly today we've remedied that in part. And again, to all of you, and from the Jewish community, from the Japanese community who are joining us, who maybe haven't joined us before, please come back again. We'll make sure you get emails and updates. Please come back again, because we've been able to hear from Indigenous community members, from former Rwandan genocide survivors, and people from a lot of different backgrounds as well. Of course, our beloved Holocaust survivors who inspire us so often with their testimony. So with that, I'm going to send it back to Daniela. But really, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And again, thank you, Ron, and thank you, Lynn, so much for helping arrange and coordinate today's program. We're so honored to be able to share your voices.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lynn, I wasn't sure if
Thank
you
you
wanted to
very
say anything.
Oh, I just wanted to thank both organizations for this wonderful opportunity. I wanted to thank Ron Shimizu for doing such a good job of blending the personal and the bigger picture. Since I represent the NAJC and the Toronto NAJC, I just wanted to clarify one point, which is that we're really proud of the fact that we've actually been a human rights organization since 1947. In fact, so the original name of the NAJC was the National Japanese Citizens, Canadian Citizens Association, and then it was renamed in 1984. So we actually are, it was just a name change, but we're almost 75 years in Canada. So thank you very much to help us continue with our work.
Thank you so much again. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We hope to see you 2 weeks from today on Wednesday, June 2nd for our next installment of In Conversation with a Survivor. You'll all be hearing from me as well. Thank you again. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks,
very
everybody.
much.